You think about the relationship that we have with art and the fact that art comes from somewhere. It doesn't just happen. There's always force or forces that draw us to it, that locate it. And I think often the artist, the poet, the writer, we get a lot more credit than truly we deserve, because really in the end, we are small compared to our art. Angels already know, because God will pull apart husks, and it will be done outside. And God will shell peas, and God will cut melons, and God will pour salt in the churn, that God will be watching. And on the day we are born, God will put box fans on wet windowsills, a wind chime in the distance. And we will be white, and we will be small, and the world around us will be brutal, but mostly we will be small. Welcome to Binder. I'm Ray McManus. With this particular poem, wrote it by basically spending maybe 2 hours with Angel upstairs. It freaked me out the first time I saw it, because I think it was dark. I was up in that space before we really had opened the galleries to the public, and so some of the lights were off, and so I come around the corner and there was this white, child-sized sculpture sitting on a chair. It shocked me. I didn't expect that. And so I spent a couple of hours with it. And the more I looked at it, the more I began to really appreciate just how much work that artist had done with that piece, from the hair to the lines in the knuckles to the swollen features. It almost looked like a drowned body that was put up on a chair. I suddenly found myself really enthralled with the genius behind it. And wow, man, that takes a lot of talent to create. Then that's when I realized, but the artist is the smallest part of all of this. The genius, all of that to create this thing, whatever that thing is, the thing replaces the artist. The poet can be as brilliant as the poet wants to be, but the poem replaces the poet, because, we go to journals, we don't see faces of poets. In the journal, we see their poems. And so I think that's a thing that I want to pull, into that poem is the reminder that all art comes from somewhere. We're lucky enough if we're the ones who are creating it. But once we create it, the thing we've created is far, far bigger than we will ever be. I personally see art as this ongoing conversation that has been taking place. What we're seeing in the painting or in the sculpture, in the poem or in the story is a snapshot of this larger conversation. And I think too often we have sort of been ingrained to think that, art for art's sake, you're there to look at it, appreciate it, or not appreciate it, whatever, but move on to the next piece. And we're missing out on a relationship that we could have with that. We're missing out on an opportunity to take that, internalize it, because when we do that, when I walk out the door of the art museum, that art's still with me. And so by doing this, by writing poetry, specifically in this case, by writing poetry about the art in this museum and any art in nature and people, whatever, I'm taking an active role in internalizing what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, and it becomes something I'm feeling. And it's something that I can carry with me for as long as I'm breathing on this earth. It no longer becomes an interaction that's purely pedestrian. And I think that to me is, as I would imagine an artist is wanting people who look at their work to walk away from that and keep it with them.
That's one of the things I love about the Write Around series is how often some of the writers go into thinking, well, I'm curious now. There was something about this piece I'm curious about. So now I've looked up the artist, and now I've looked up something else about the era, and I've looked up something that I just never knew, and it informed then my own work, even though that also connected to a very personal lived experience as well.
You're hearing the voice of Joelle Ryan-Cook, CMA's Deputy Director. I think, being able to work with you, you really kind of exemplify a lot of the energy about this place, right? Where there's a seriousness about the work that is being done here, but there's a lot of enthusiasm and this genuine, earnest seeking for as many opportunities as we can to get people into the museum and to get the museum out to the people. You know, you're like one of my top 10 revolutionaries in those regards.
I love it when I can be wearing a suit jacket and heels and be called a revolutionary at the same time. And that's what the museum world gives you, you know? And I think it's what inspires me is I have been part of this organization for so long because what I love about it is it never stands still. We're always changing and we're always looking for new projects. So being in a museum environment allows you to constantly learn because it is about stories. And I think art museums and the arts has been considered a very elite kind of place to go to. And I have spent my whole career trying to battle that idea that art museums are elite. And people get intimidated and they come in and they think, I'm supposed to have a PhD in art history and know all about Renaissance art before I can look at that piece. And I'm afraid I don't have the answer. But the truth is, when you work with art every day, the way we work with art every day, we all understand whether that art is visual art, poetry, music, theater. What we bring to the art form itself is a deeply valid response to the art. And I think anyone who creates knows there's something that's in their own head and there's something that spurred them to create. But they also know that conversation between the object, the piece, the composition, and the receiver, that space in between is where all the rich storytelling happens. So even when I would tour around little kids from school programs and you would have a painting with a landscape and a boat and you have a little guy that goes, well, my grandpa has a boat and so I'm going to talk about my grandpa's boat. At first you go, oh, wait a minute. No, we're going to talk about this painting. And you're like, no, this painting, what it's doing is making that kid think about his grandpa.
That's right.
And so the work that you've done with poets and with other writers has been grown-ups thinking about their grandpa and writing about that boat. Yep. And that's what's so rich. It's where that human experience comes together. And so for me, all those years of programming that we have done, it's only the beginning of it. And we really love the way other art forms help tell the stories that the visual arts in this organization can be just seriously a platform for starting those conversations and starting storytelling. And what do we learn? And how many times have you come to a program here at this museum or gone to the Koger Center or read something from a student that all of a sudden your brain opened up and you thought differently about the world or a corner of the world? And I think that's the work we're really supposed to be doing here.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what makes it a rich experience, you know? So whether you do that very quietly on your own and you love to read every label and every text panel and buy a catalog and read it, or you're somebody who's like, I don't do any of that, but I'm going to watch every kind of music performance that happens in this museum because it makes me love being in the galleries too. All of those are valid experiences and everything in between. And that's the kind of thing that we want to capture here. There's different kinds of participants in an organization like this or in the arts, and the stories come out of those different ways of receiving that art and how you respond to it.
What you described is exactly the sort of motto that has been behind the way I approach poetry. You know, that the same idea, right? That people think you had to have a PhD in literature to be able to read poetry. And I can't tell you how many times I give a reading or I talk to somebody about poetry and they'll tell me, you know, well, I never got poetry, but then I heard you read it and I heard you talk about it and suddenly it makes sense. I don't get it. And it's because I am just telling them about my granddad's boat. Art was not designed or created for the elites. I mean, you know, they enjoyed it, they paid for it, but the artists themselves were just human beings and trying to express themselves in a way that they were gifted enough to be able to do. And then we get the benefit, right, of being able to interact with it for, God, centuries. It would be kind of a wild trip, right? If we could go back and somehow converse with the artist who is long since dead to tell them how people are interacting with their work now, to get their sort of reaction from that. I think they would be blown away.
I think it would be too. And then especially depending on the context of when that work was created and why.
I love abstract art. It was not legal because in 1934 they decided that if workers didn't understand this art, then you weren't supporting the worker state. So that was why socialist realism had to be realistic, had to show optimistic themes, it had to be supporting the government, making workers look happy. So anything that deviated from that seemed to be deviant behavior, literally. Sometimes I think about this, like, for example, with my mom. You know, all of our moms and grandmothers who wanted to be doctors, wanted to be mathematicians, and couldn't because that wasn't the message they got. So they took the nursing, the teaching job that they were told they should get. That's a different version of this story where you want to express yourself and you're told there's only one way to do it. And then if you try to do the other thing, you're going to get threatening phone calls, you're going to be sent to a labor camp, you're going to be put into military service. And even if you didn't experience that, someone you know did, and you were afraid of that every day. I'm Catherine Walworth. I'm curator here at the Columbia Museum of Art, and I'm sort of the big heart behind the Ironic Curtain and why it's here. I titled it The Ironic Curtain because there's so much absurdity and humor. You can't read a book about this without having the word irony come up, because they were living in this just sort of a weird world of made up facts, and that they were supposed to be living in the best country on earth and they had everything they needed, but really they're in breadlines. And so reality was this weird thing, and the artists had to learn to make art that propped up that government story. So these artists were trying to find ways to tell other stories and secretly find out about their own Russian art history from the avant-garde from the teens and 20s that then in the 30s was literally kept away from them, and nobody learned about it unless you found a foreign journal, or there was someone who collected it and you would go to their apartment, but they were always a foreigner too. So it's this like moments of discovery where someone literally kind of lifts the curtain, you see some possibility, and then you go home to your apartment and you make something out of it. But you can't ever show it, and you can't talk about it, really.
I mean, you know, of course, we always constantly try to draw parallels, similarities, right? And for a lot of artist friends of mine and poets and fiction writers, it's not that they are against the establishment. They just don't have the desire to necessarily climb those ladders and go through those holes when they really, their true desire is to create art, to create poems, to create stories, and then to share them to people who actually want to hear them. And in what I find to be so fascinating about this particular show is that because of the art being behind that iron curtain, that everything is going against them to prevent them from being able to do that. And yet they still created, they still did it. And it really kind of comes back to that the true essence, if you will, of creating art.
Yeah, it reminds me of like plants that grow in the cracks and sidewalks, like,
right.
Like nature's going to get through. And there was a mental condition that they had to work in the midst of. And part of it was just the sadness that the only people buying their work were outside of the Soviet Union. So your work would disappear. If you wanted to be a successful artist, you could never see your art again.
Wow.
So they would have exhibitions in London or Paris, and then the word would get back to Moscow and they would crack down on them. But you didn't see it, and you didn't get to see your work next to anyone else's work that you know. So they would occasionally, that's why they would push the envelope and have, for example, what came to be known as the Bulldozer Exhibition. And it's called that because it was bulldozed over by the KGB. But just showing your work in the midst of people that you care about was a really big emotional deal for them. And they had tried to get a permit to do that because it wasn't a public park. It was far enough out. The KGB couldn't figure out how to officially crack down. Because if they had done something technically wrong, you could threaten them with 2 years in labor camp. But that didn't happen, so they sent plainclothes KGB agents to pretend to be cleaning up the park with water cannons, and they beat up the artists and destroyed the art. But because there were so many foreign journalists and diplomats there, and it made it on the cover of the New York Times, that was a threat to the government. So they allowed a 4-hour show 2 weeks later for these artists, many of the same artists, But those artists were then cracked down on, and there were repercussions for having been in that so-called official show later. So you kind of couldn't win. So you just had to keep going and find those cracks in the pavement.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and again, I think it's something that we take truly for granted here, right? I mean, because there's, we throw these terms around all the time, and it's not to simplify or to discredit or discount what other people are feeling, but when you see it in this context, you literally have a government force intentionally destroying or keeping you from being able to freely create, freely express. And, these are not, the fact that these artists are continuing to do that, they're not just artists, man. They're like revolutionaries. I mean, this is inspiring.
So much of what you said is relevant. First of all, the planning of this, we were definitely in the last administration when this was being planned. And I knew that whatever way the election went, it would have a useful message, depending on what it was. Because when you're throwing out terms like enemy of the people, I don't think people realize what that means. I mean, that's a real historic phrase, so, or when you're saying, I had the biggest crowds ever and you didn't, that's a very Stalinist thing to say. I mean, he would literally make himself look taller in photographs or erase people that he had purged. And it's like the way that the last administration had turnover, and you had to there were many parallels that I found really scary, and I didn't think anyone else was seeing, but I was working on the show and I'm like, okay, this is going to be powerful, but also very unfamiliar because, this is a story that really hasn't been told very often.
Ironic Curtain is on view through September 12th. Coming up,
generally, we're reflecting on the year 2020. We're thinking about protest, a pandemic, how that affected us socially, politically, racially.
Looking back at 2020 through a different lens right after this break.
Hey y'all, producer Drew here to fill up your social calendar for September with some exciting CMA programming. On September 8th and the 14th, take a tour and get a new perspective on Amanda McCaver's Bright Little Day Stars with volunteer coordinator and installation assistant Jackie Palmieri. On September 22nd, grab a cocktail and a seat for a panel discussion featuring Carol Suvion, executive producer and director of the Peabody Award-winning and Emmy-nominated PBS series Craft in America. On September 25th, get your dancing shoes ready for Shea Alexander Presents Live on Boyd Plaza with popular Charlotte-based outfit Reggie Graves and Jazz Theory. You can find out more about these and all of our upcoming programs and events on our website, www.columbiamuseum.org. And now, back to the show.
All right, so I'm with Jackie Adams, Director of Art and Learning, but in this case, more specifically, the curator for Hindsight 2020. Hey, Jackie, how you doing?
Hi, Ray. Doing well.
Good.
Thank you.
Tell our listeners a little bit about what Hindsight 2020 is all about here. What is this show?
Yeah. I'd always wanted to put on a photography show of photojournalists that I had been following for the past, 15 plus years. I admire their work. I think that these folks do on the ground storytelling that just documents so many different facets of our life that frankly is kind of hard to get just on your own. So I really treasure what these creatives do.
You talk about the storytelling, and I think what's neat about, especially with photography and as a poet, it's something that I can totally relate to because a photographer is capturing a moment that might have happened in a split second, right? Of everything else going on around them. They capture this moment and that moment ends up creating a whole story behind it. We went through we'll just say a pretty weird 4 years. During that time, we saw a lot of massive, movements, and probably one of the most eye-opening and very telling movement, of course, was the Black Lives Matter movement. And it really was an opportunity for us to educate ourselves and to learn more about how systemic racism and a lot of these things that are working around us and have been around us for a very long time, maybe even from the beginning, that we just never paid any attention to. And now we can start to maybe have a conversation about, well, who are we now? And so, there are some really compelling images that some of the photographers managed to capture. I think anyone who is a writer, a poet, or anyone who just encounters it can't help but be sort of taken by the story that image. Then I'm thinking of the one, right, with the young lady there with the cell phone, right? We're wondering if maybe you'd want to talk some about how we can kind of look back at these images now and think about who we are now.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Oh gosh, that gives me a lot to think about, and I'm having lots of thoughts in terms of where to go with that. I'll start with Crush Rush's piece. It's a very poignant piece. It's going to be one of the key pieces I think people will react to in the show. And if I could stage it, it's a female standing point blank facing a line of police. And she holds up a cell phone to take a photo, and the police are holding weapons back at her. It's a very confrontational piece. There is a real energy there, and there's a lot to break down. So when you think about the story aspect, your mind goes to not only the tension that's happening in the moment, but you're also thinking about what came before, what's happening now, and what's happening after. I mean, just like when you would tell a story, you're going to start off somewhere, you're going to take people somewhere, and you're going to wrap it up, right? These photographs are going to give you clues to taking you along that journey. So if you just get wrapped up in the moment, you're going to lose sight of the bigger picture that these photographers want you to think about. So when we think about that in a time-space continuum, I think that's even more interesting. So 2020 started off with a bang. I think everybody had high hopes for the year. And then all of a sudden, it was like this roller coaster that just took you straight down into the pits of everything. And you had to find yourself on this really just confusing ride of where are you going, what do you do? And it was very topsy-turvy. And so we spent the better part of the year doing that. And even the photographers admitted to me in conversation that a lot of times they're just reacting and responding to the moment. A lot of times they're showing up, they're shooting pictures. They don't even know what they're capturing. They don't, in some cases, don't know what the story is either. They're not figuring it out until after the fact. So it's kind of interesting because our viewers are going to be the same way. I think now is a great time to put this kind of work in front of people, not only for the reflection aspect, but I was listening to some folks online recently who talked about, especially from the racial standpoint, how you're hearing the word reckoning a lot right now. And I use that term, how we're going through a racial reckoning or political reckoning, things like that. So reckoning is a big word. But the Times, I believe, came out with a big article on how we're moving into this second phase of thinking called racial resentment. And it was such a unique idea. And it kind of couches itself in this idea of complacency and the idea that you faced something, but now you can hide from it. And so I think now it's even more important to kind of double down and come back to the table with the questions. You know, Thomas Hammond, one of the photographers, said to me, he said, when I took these photos, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was capturing. I mean, I knew, but I didn't know what the impact was going to be. And he said, I'll be honest with you, it left me with more questions than answers. So if we're in that place, that's great. That's great.
We see the product that a photographer, we see the photo. And, I think as with all art, with all literature, we think sometimes we're going to it. Maybe there's a question posed, maybe it's a meta question, but at some point there's an answer here. I'm going to get an answer. It's going to tell me what I need to think or what I need to feel, and I can agree or disagree with it. But that's never really been the case for art. I mean, art really sometimes is about posing more questions, getting us to think, getting us to ask these questions, because I mean, that really is part of the goal, if you will, for just the basic critical thinking. I mean, you know, and
Absolutely.
so the more we're asking questions, the more we're thinking. And, you know, and unfortunately, I think, you know, without art, really what we get is somebody to tell us what to think and how to think. And that has happened for quite some time. And then suddenly we're encountered with this image or this poem that counters those things that we've always been told. And there is this resistance at first.
Absolutely. I mean, even the photographers found themselves fundamentally questioning systems. I think they showed up to do a job. First and foremost, they're all professionals. I think they showed up with the intention of, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to capture what's happening. But I think throughout the process, they even found themselves questioning systems of race, politics, leadership. And I think that kind of surprised them to some extent, because I think that they were forced into a place where they had to separate personal and professional selves.
Yeah.
And I think that led to some really even more interesting photos, because I think that those two started to blend together a little bit. And those questions got deeper and the work got richer.
Hindsight 2020 is on view through October 24th. If you got wrapped up in my conversation with Jackie, I've got some good news. We've got a bonus episode with the whole interview on our website, columbiamuseum.org. If you think about the art that is the most daring, the art that stays with you the most, isn't always the art that's speaking to, you know, a governmental power or to oppression. It's speaking to you and captures you. Well, guess what? You as the viewer, listener, audience, you do have all the power. And when it speaks to you and hits you in a way that causes you to pay attention, then you can really begin to see how art can really work in probably a more auspicious sort of way. When you think about the artwork in Ironic Curtain, for instance, or you think about, you know, some of the spoken word pieces that you might hear, where there is a subject that the speaker is clearly calling out, or that the artist is clearly directing a message to, you become a part of that message. You are an active participant in the messaging that's taking place. When we're able to be an active participant in that, there's a belonging that takes place, a community that forms. And I think that is the magic behind the power of art. And I don't think that's always the thing that, you know, some artists are clearly trying to do that. And sometimes they're not. And it just happens. And because as we create these things outside of ourselves, they can take lives of their own and become something to someone else that you never intended it to be. And it becomes then suddenly their voice for what they need. So in this podcast, we're going to be talking with writers, artists, photographers, curators about what is going into what they create, why they make it, and take some time to reflect on what it means. I hope you'll join us for the conversation. Thank you for listening. Until next time. You've been listening to Binder, a production of Columbia Museum of Art. Today's episode was hosted by me, Ray McManus, produced and edited by Drew Barron, with special assistance from Joelle Ryan-Cook. For more information about Binder, CMA exhibitions, and programs, please visit our website at www.columbiamuseum.org.